Hello, and welcome to People of the Pod, brought to you by American Jewish Committee. Each week, we take you beyond the headlines to help you understand what they all mean for America, Israel, and the Jewish people. I'm your host, Manya Brashear-Pashman. As the international community looks to phase 2 of the ceasefire between Israel and the Hamas terror group in Gaza, the American Jewish Committee office in Abu Dhabi invited Dr. Tal Becker to participate in discussions about what's next for the region. Dr. Becker is one of Israel's leading experts on international humanitarian law and a veteran peace negotiator with Palestinians, Lebanese, and Syrians. He is currently vice president of the Shalom Hartman Institute, and he joins us now, right after the conference in Abu Dhabi, to share some of the insights he contributed there. Tal, welcome to People of the Pod.
Thank you very much, Manya.
So, Tal, you have just returned from a conference in Abu Dhabi where you really took a deep dive, kind of exploring the nature of Arab-Israeli relations as we are now entering the second phase, right, of the ceasefire between Israel and Gaza. So I'm just curious, you've been steeped in this for so long, for decades. Do you sense, or did you sense, a significant shift in the region when it comes to Arab-Israeli relations and the future?
So I think, Manya, we're at a very interesting moment, and it's hard to say exactly which direction it's going because on the one hand, we have had very significant military successes. I think a lot of the spoilers in the region have been significantly set back, though they're still there. But Israel really has had to focus on the military side of things a lot. And it, I think, has strained, to some extent, the view of what's possible because we've been so focused on the military side. And I think it is a moment for imagining what's possible. And how do we pivot out of the tragedy and suffering of this war, make the most of the military successes we've had, and really begin to imagine what this region could look like if we're going to continue to succeed in pushing back the spoilers in this way. Israel is a regional power. And I think for all our vulnerability, that requires, to some extent, for Israel to really articulate a vision that it has for the region. And it's going to take a little bit of time, I think, for everybody to really internalize what's just happened over these last 2 years and what it means for the potential for good and how we navigate that. So I really think it's kind of like what they call a plastic moment right now.
A plastic moment. Can you define that? What do you mean by plastic?
So plastic moment, meaning it's that moment, it's an inflection point where things could go in one direction or another, and you have to be smart enough to take advantage of the fluidity of the moment to really emphasize how do we maximize prosperity, stability, coexistence? How do we take away not just the capabilities of the enemies of peace, but also the appeal of their agenda, the language that they use, the way they try to present Muslim-Jewish relations as if they're a kind of zero-sum game. So how do we operate both on the economic side, on the security side, but also on the imagining what's possible side, on the peace side, as difficult as that is. And I don't want to suggest that, there aren't serious obstacles. There are, but there's also really serious opportunities.
So what did you sense when you were there in terms of the perception of Israel? I mean, were people optimistic, for lack of a better term?
So first of all, it was, a great opportunity to be there and having been involved personally very intensively in the Abraham Accords, I always feel a bit emotional whenever I'm in the Emirates in particular and Morocco and Bahrain and so on. And to be honest, I kind of feel at home there. And so that's a lovely thing. I think on the one hand, I would say there's a relief that hopefully, please God, the war in Gaza is behind us and that we're now looking at how to really kind of move into the phase of the disarmament of Hamas and the removal of Hamas from governance, working with the Trump team and the Trump plan. And I think they have a bunch of questions, right? The Emiratis in particular are strategic thinkers. They really want to be partners in advancing prosperity and stability across the region, in pushing back extremism across the region. And I think they're eager to see in Israel a partner for that effort. And I think it puts also a responsibility on both of us to understand the concerns we each have. It takes some time to really internalize what it is for a country to face a seven-front war with organizations that call for its annihilation and all the pressure and anxiety that that produces for a people, frankly, that hasn't had the easiest history in terms of the agenda of people hating the Jewish people and persecuting them. So I think that takes a bit of appreciation. I think we also, in the return, need to appreciate the concerns of our regional partners in terms of making sure that the region is stable, in terms of giving an opportunity for, one way I sometimes word it is that, we need to prepare for the worst case scenario. We need to prevent it from being a self-fulfilling prophecy, which really requires you to kind of develop a policy that nevertheless gives an opportunity for things to get better, not just plan for things to get worse. And I think our partners in the Gulf in particular really want to hear from us what we can do to make things better, even while we're planning and maybe even a bit cynical that things might be very difficult.
So you mentioned the Abraham Accords, and I'm curious if you feel that Israel, I know Israel has felt isolated at times, very isolated, and perhaps abandoned is even the correct word. Do you feel that that is the case as we enter the second phase of this ceasefire? Do you feel that is less so the case? And do you feel that that might be less so the case because of the Abraham Accords' existence?
So let's first talk about the Abraham Accords and their significance, right? So I think a lot of people present the Abraham Accords as an agreement that is about shared interests and shared challenges and so on, and that's definitely true. But they are, in my view, at least aspirationally, something much bigger than that. First of all, they are almost the articulation of what I call a Judeo-Muslim civilization, the view that Jews and Muslims, or that all different peoples of the Middle East, belong to this place and have a responsibility for shaping its future. The way I describe the Abraham Accords is that they're a group of countries who basically have said that the argument about who the land belongs to is not as important as understanding that we all belong to the land. And as a result of that, this is kind of a partnership against the forces of extremism and chaos, and really offering a version of Israeli Jewish identity and of Muslim Arab identity that is in competition with the Iranian Hezbollah Hamas narrative that kind of condemns us to this zero-sum conflict. So the first thing to say is that I think the Abraham Accords have such tremendous potential for reimagining the relationship between Muslims and Jews, for reimagining the future of the region, and for really making sure that the enemies of peace no longer shape our agenda, even if they're still there. So in that sense, the opening that the Abraham Accords offers is an opening to kind of reimagine the region as a whole. And I think that's really important. And I think we have now an opportunity to deepen the Accords, potentially to expand them to other countries, and in doing so, to kind of set back the forces of extremism in the region. In a strange way, I would say that Israel is more challenged right now in the West than we are in the Middle East. Because in the West, you see, there's backlash and it's a complicated picture, but you can see a kind of increasing voices that challenge Israel's legitimacy, that are really questioning our story. And you see that both on the extreme left and extreme right in different countries across the West, in different degrees. In the Middle East, paradoxically, you have at least a partnership around accepting one another within the region that seems to me to be very promising. And in part, I have to say, it's really important to understand, for all the tragedy and difficulty of this war, Israel demonstrated an unbelievable resilience, unbelievable strength in dealing with its adversaries, an unbelievable capacity despite this seven-front challenge. And I think that itself, in a region that's a very difficult region, is attractive. I think we do have a responsibility and an interest in imagining how we can begin to heal, if that's a word we can use, the Israeli-Palestinian relationship, at least move in a better direction, use the Trump plan to do that, because that, I think, will also help our relationship in the region as a whole without making one dependent on the other.
So I want to follow up on what you just said, that Israel faces perhaps many more challenges in the West than in the region. What about the Jewish people? Would you apply that same statement to the Jewish people?
Well, I think we've seen the rise of anti-Semitism. And in my view, one way to think about October 7th is that October 7th marks the end of the post-Holocaust era. So there were a few decades there where even if anti-Semitism existed, there were many circles in which it was socially unacceptable to give it voice. And something has shattered in the West in particular, that it seems to be more socially acceptable to express anti-Semitic or anti-Semitic adjacent type views. And that, I think, has really shocked and shaken many Jews across the Western world. I guess the thing I would say about that is, some of the Jews I come across in the West were under, in my view, a bit of an illusion that anti-Semitism had somehow been cured. You feel this sometimes in North America, and that essentially we had reached a stage in Jewish history where anti-Semitism was broadly a thing of the past and was on the margins. And then the ferocity with which it came back on October 8th was like a trauma, and one of the definitions of trauma is that trauma is a severe challenge to the way you understand the world and your place in it. And so if you had this understanding of your reality that anti-Semitism was essentially a thing of the past in North America in particular, yes, and then all of a sudden it came back, you can see that traumatic experience. And what I want to argue or suggest is that the problem isn't that we had the solution and lost it. I think the problem was we had an illusion that there was a solution in the first place. Unfortunately, I think the Jewish people's history tells the story that anti-Semitism is kind of like the zombie apocalypse, right? It never exactly disappears. You can sometimes marginalize it more or marginalize it less. And we're now entering an era which I think Jews are familiar with, which is an era that it is becoming more socially acceptable to be anti-Semitic, and that to some extent Jewish communal life feels more conditional, and Jewish identity, and while being accepted in the societies in which you live, also feels more conditional. And while that is a familiar pattern, we are probably the generation of Jews with more resources, more influence, more power, more capacity than probably at any other time in Jewish history. And so it would be a mistake, I think, to think of us as kind of going back to some previous era. Yes, there are these challenges, but there are also a whole set of tools. We didn't have the F-35 during the Spanish Inquisition. And so I think that despite all these challenges, it's also a great moment of opportunity for really building Jewish communities that are resilient, that have strong Jewish identity, that have a depth of Jewish literacy, and trying to inoculate as much as possible the societies in which we live and the communities in which we live from that phenomenon of anti-Semitism, perhaps better than we had done in previous iterations of this.
I also want to go back and explore another term that you've used a couple of times, and that is enemies of peace. And I'm curious how you define the enemies of peace. Who are you talking about? And I'm asking you to kind of take a step back and really broaden that definition as much as possible.
Well, it goes back to that idea that I mentioned about the Abraham Accords, which is an understanding that there are different peoples in the Middle East that call it home. And each of those peoples deserves a place where they can nurture their identity and cultivate it and have their legitimacy respected. And in that sense, those who are engaged in a kind of zero-sum competition that feel that their existence depends on the obliteration of the other, I see those as enemies of peace. I believe that both Jews and Palestinians, for example, have a right to self-determination. I think that both belong in the sense that both deserve the capacity to cultivate their own identity. But the right to self-determination, for example, the Palestinian right to self-determination, doesn't include the right to deny the Jewish right to self-determination. It doesn't include the right to erase Jewish history, in the same way that we as Jews need to come to terms with the fact that the Palestinian people feel a real connection to this place. Now, it's very difficult given how radicalized Palestinian society is, and we have to be very realistic about the threats we face, because for as long as the dominant narrative in Palestinian society is a rejection of Jewish belongingness and self-determination, we have a very difficult challenge ahead of us. But I essentially, broadly speaking, would say the enemies of peace are those who want to lock us into a zero-sum contest where essentially they view the welfare of the other as a threat to themselves. We have no conflict with Lebanon. We have no conflict with the people of Iran, for example. We have a conflict, in fact, a zero-sum conflict with an Iranian regime that wants to annihilate Israel. And I often point to this kind of discrepancy that Iran would like to destroy Israel, and Israel has the audacity to want not to be destroyed by Iran, right? That is not an equivalent moral playing field, right? And so I view the Iranian regime with that kind of agenda as an enemy of peace. And I think Israel has an obligation to also articulate what its aspirations are in those regards, even if it's a long time horizon to realize those aspirations, because the enemies are out there and they do need to be confronted effectively and pretty relentlessly.
For our series on the Abraham Accords, Architects of Peace, I spoke with Dr. Ali Al-Nuami, and we talked about the need for the narrative to change, and the narrative on both sides, right? The narrative to change about kind of what you referred to as a zero-sum game. And for the narrative, especially out of Israel, about the Palestinians to change. And I'm curious if you've given that any thought about changing or just Israel's ability or obligation to send a message about the need for the Palestinians, indeed, to achieve self-determination and thrive.
Well, I think first it's important to articulate how difficult that is, simply because, Israel has faced now 2 years of war, and the sense that I think many Israelis felt was that Palestinian society at large was not opposed to what happened on October 7th. And the dominant narratives in Palestinian society, whether viewing Israel as some kind of affront to Islam or viewing Israel as a kind of colonial enterprise, to then be like in the business of suggesting a positive vision in the face of that is very difficult. And we do tend in these situations, when we say the narrative has to change, we then say on the other side, they have to change the narrative rather than directing that to ourselves. So I think, there is an obligation for everyone to think about how best to articulate their vision. It's a huge, I think, obligation on the Palestinian leadership. And it's one they've proved incapable of doing until now, which is genuinely come to terms with the Jewish people's belongingness to this part of the world and to their right to self-determination. It's a core aspect of the difficulty in addressing this conflict. And having said all that, I think we, as Israeli Jews, also have an obligation to offer that positive vision. In my mind, there is nothing wrong with articulating an aspiration you're not sure you can realize, right? Or you don't even know how to realize, but simply to signal that is the direction that I'm going in. Prime Minister Netanyahu, for example, talks about that he wants the Palestinian people to have all the power to govern themselves and none of the power to threaten Israel, which is a way of saying that the Palestinian people should have that capacity of self-determination that gives them the potential for peace, prosperity, dignity, and security, but not if the purpose of that is to essentially be more focused on destroying Israel than it is on building up Palestinian identity. Now, that I think can be articulated in positive terms without denying Israel's connection to the land, without denying the Jewish people's story, but recognizing the other. And yes, I think despite all the difficulties, victory in war is also about what you want to build, not just what you want to destroy. And in that sense, our ability to kind of frame what we're doing in positive terms, in other words, not just how we want to take away the capacities of the extremists, but what we want to build, if we had partners for that, actually helps create that momentum. So I would just say to Dr. Ali's point that I think that's a shared burden on all of us. And the more people that can use that language, it can actually, I think, help to create the spaces where things that feel not possible begin to maybe become possible.
Which in many ways, the Trump's 20-point plan does that. It doesn't just only talk about disarming Hamas. It talks about rebuilding Gaza. Are there other ways in which Israel can assure the success of the Palestinian people and push forward? Can you envision other ways?
Well, I'm sure there's lots that a lot of people can do, but there is a burden on the Palestinian people themselves. And I do find that a lot of this discourse kind of takes agency away from the Palestinian people and their leadership, right? In a way, there's a kind of honesty to the Trump plan and the Security Council resolution that was adopted endorsing the plan that has been missing for quite a while. The Trump plan, interestingly, says three things, right? It says on this issue of a kind of vision or pathway, it says, first of all, it basically says there is no Palestinian state today, which must have come as a bit of a shock for those countries recognizing a Palestinian state. But I think that's, that is a common understanding, right? It's a little bit of an illusion to imagine that state. The second thing is how critical it is for there to be PA reform, genuine reform, so that there is a responsible, functioning Palestinian governing authority that can actually, be focused on the welfare of its people and govern well. And the third is that then creates a potential pathway for increasing Palestinian self-determination and moving potentially towards Palestinian statehood. I think provided that that entity is not going to be used as a kind of terror state or a failed state, right? But that, I think, is a kind of honest way of framing the issue. But we don't get around, Manya, the need for responsibility, right, for agency. So yes, Israel has responsibility. Yes, the countries of the region have responsibilities. But ultimately, the core constituency that needs to demonstrate that it is shifting its mindset and more focused on building itself up rather than telling a story about how it is seeking to deny Jewish self-determination is the Palestinian leadership. And I do think that what's happening in Gaza at least gives the potential for that. You have the potential for an alternative Palestinian governance to emerge. You have the potential for Hamas to be set back in a way that it no longer has a governing role or a shape in shaping the agenda. And I think if we can make Gaza gradually a success story, this is a bit too optimistic for an Israeli to say, but maybe we can begin to create a momentum that can redefine the Israeli-Palestinian relationship.
So I asked, what can Israel do to move forward, to assure the Palestinians that they are behind their success and thriving? What can Israel do to make sure that it's respected, that it's not facing the challenges from the West, from that region? What can Israel do? What is Israel's obligation? Or is that an unfair question to ensure its success and its moving forward?
I think it's a really difficult question because the criticism that Israel has gotten throughout this war and the threats to its legitimacy in the way that they've erupted, I think is a really complicated phenomenon that has many moving parts. So some part of it, I think, rightly is about Israeli policy and Israeli language and the way it has framed what it has been doing, and really the unbelievable moral dilemmas that the war in Gaza posed and how Israel conducted itself in the way of those dilemmas, and people can have different views about that. I think there's a misunderstanding very significantly of the nature of the battlefield and how impossible Hamas, in its deliberate kind of weaponization of the civilian population, made that. So there's one component that has to do with Israel. There's another component that we can't ignore that has to do with anti-Semitism. And that, I think, for that group, right, who are almost define themselves through their hostility towards the Jewish people and towards the very idea of Jewish self-determination, it's hard to think anything that Israel says or does that actually matters, right? These were the people who were criticizing Israel even before it responded. And so in that sense, I think putting too much on Israel is a problem. Maybe I'll just focus on the area that I think is most interesting here, and that is, in my view, a lot of the argument about Israel in the West, we'll take the US, for example, is actually not an argument about Israel, but more an argument about the US that is channeled through Israel. In other words, a lot of people seem to be having their argument about America's story of itself channeled through their argument about Israel. And what they're actually arguing about is their vision of America. And you can see different versions of this. There's a story of America as perhaps a kind of white Christian country that was exploited by immigrants and is exploited by other countries in the world. And that narrative kind of pushes you in a direction of having a certain view, in my view, mistaken in any event, about Israel, that is more to do about your story of America than it has anything to do with what Israel is doing or saying. And then you hear this very loudly, and I'm not suggesting these are exactly even, but on the more radical kind of progressive left, you have a story of America as essentially a country that never came over the legacy of slavery, a country that has to kind of apologize for its power, that it sees itself as a colonial entity that can't be redeemed. And when you're kind of locked in that version of America, which I kind of think is a kind of self-hating story of America, then that then projects the way you view Israel more than anything Israel says or does. So this has a lot to do with America's, and this is true of other countries in the West, that internal struggle. And then the way different actors, especially in the social media age, need to position themselves on the Israel issue to identify which tribe they belong to in this other battle, you know? So in my view, people who care about the US-Israel relationship, for example, would be wise to invest in the battle over America's story of itself. And in that sense, it's less about Israeli public diplomacy and less about Israeli policy. It's much more about the glasses people wear when they look at Israel. And how do you influence those glasses?
I could sit here and talk to you all day. This is really fascinating and thought-provoking. I do want to ask two more questions, though. And one is, I've been harping on what can Israel do? What are Israel's obligations? But let me back up a step. What about the Arab states? What are the other neighbors in the region obligated to do to assure the Palestinians that they're going to succeed and thrive?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important question. And I think that for many, many years, we suffered from, I would say, a basic lack of courage from Arab states. I'm generalizing, but a hope that others would advance their interests for them. And in some sense, I think the Abraham Accords really flipped that, because the Abraham Accords was the Arab states having the courage and the voice to say, we need to redefine our relationship with Israel, and in that way create conditions potentially for Palestinians to do the same. I would say that there are a whole set, not my position to kind of be the lecturer, and each country is different in their own dynamics. I think the first, from an Israeli perspective, of course, is to really push back against this attempt to delegitimize the Jewish people's belonging in the Middle East, and not to allow this kind of narrative where the only authentic way to be a Palestinian or a Muslim is to reject the idea that other peoples live in the region and have a story that connects them to it, and Israel is here to stay, and it can be a partner. You can have disagreements with it, but the idea that it's some kind of illegitimate entity, I think, needs to be taken out of the lexicon fundamentally. I think a second area is in really this expectation of Palestinian, especially in the Israeli-Palestinian context, of being partners in holding the Palestinians accountable, not to have the kind of the soft bigotry of low expectations, right? And to really recognize Palestinian agency, Palestinian responsibility, and also Palestinian rights, yes, but not in this kind of comic strip victim-villain narrative where Israel has all the responsibilities and the Palestinians have all the rights, right? My colleague Einat Wilf, for example, talks about Schrodinger's Palestine, Schrodinger's cat, right? So Schrodinger's Palestine is that, Palestinians are recognized for rights, but they're not recognized for responsibilities. And Israel has rights and responsibilities, and I think putting that to, and finally, I would say, in terms of the taking seriously the spoilers in the region and working with Israel and with our partners to make sure that the spoilers in the region don't dictate the agenda and don't have the capacity to do so. Not just hoping that, Israel and the US will take care of that, but really working with us. And I think a few countries are really stepping up in that regard. They have their own constraints, and we need to be respectful of that, and I understand that. But I think that this is a strategic partnership. I sometimes joke that with the Emirates, it's a Jewish and a Muslim state, but it's a Catholic marriage, right? We've kind of decided to bind together in this kind of strategic partnership that has withstood these last 2 years, because we want to share a vision of the Middle East that is to the benefit of all peoples. And that means doing kind of three things at once. I mean, confronting the spoilers on the one hand, investing in regional integration on the other, and seeing how we can improve Israeli-Palestinian relations at the same time. So working in parallel on all three issues and helping each other in the process and each other thrive. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff beyond the conflict. There's, AI and fighting desertification and irrigation and defense tech and intelligence and a whole host of areas where we can cooperate and empower each other and be genuine partners and strengthen our own societies and the welfare of our own peoples through that partnership for ourselves, for each other, and for the region. So there's a lot to do.
And my last question, I've asked, what do the Arab states need to do? What does Israel need to do? What do Jewish advocates around the world need to do?
The most important thing at this moment for me, Manya, is courage. There is a danger because of the rise in antisemitism and the kind of hostility that one sees, that Jews in particular will become more silent. And they'll kind of hide a little bit in the hope that this will somehow pass them. And I think what our history has taught us is generally these are phenomena that if you don't stand up against them early, they become extremely powerful down the line, and it becomes very, very costly to confront them. So, it takes courage, but I would say that communities can show more courage than individuals can. And in that sense, I think, insisting on the rights of Jews within the societies in which they live, fighting for those kind of societies that all peoples can prosper in, being strong advocates for a kind of society in which Jews are able to thrive and be resilient and prosper, as well as others as well, I think is very important. Just in a nutshell, I will say that it seems to me that in much of the world, what we're seeing is liberalism being kind of hijacked by a radical version of progressivism, and nationalism being hijacked by a version of ultranationalism. And for Jews and for most people, the best place to be is in liberal nationalism. Liberal nationalism offers you respect for collective identity on the one hand, but also respect for individual autonomy on the other, right? That's that beautiful blend of liberal nationalism. In that way, at least aspirationally, Israel being a Jewish and democratic state is really about, on the one hand, being part of a story bigger than yourself, but on the other hand, living a society that sees individual rights and individual agency and autonomy. And that blend is critical for human thriving and for meaning, and it's been critical for Jews as well. And so, particularly across the diaspora, really fighting for a liberal national identity, which is being assaulted from the extremes on both sides, seems to me to be an urgent mission. And it's urgent not just for Jews to be able not to kind of live conditionally and under fear and intimidation within the societies they live, but as we've seen throughout history, it's pretty critical for the thriving of that society itself. At the end of the day, societies that get cannibalized by extremes end up being societies that rot from within. And so I would say Jews need to be advocates for their own rights, double down on Jewish identity, on resilience, and on literacy, on Jewish literacy, at the same time as fighting for the kind of society in which the extremes don't shape the agenda. That would be my wish.
Making liberal nationalism an urgent mission for all societies. In other words, being a force for good.
Yes, of course.
Our universal mission. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing all of these thoughts with us, and safe travels as you take off for the next destination.
Thank you very much, man. I appreciate it.
As we approach the end of the year, and what a year it's been, take some time to catch up on episodes you might have missed along the way. Rewind and listen to some of my more memorable interviews, such as my conversation with former Israeli hostage Shushan Haran, abducted with her daughter, son-in-law, and grandchildren during the Hamas terror attack on October 7, 2023. Meet Drs. Or Hen and Ernest Frankel, two MIT professors who, amid anti-Israel academic boycotts, are trying to salvage the valuable research gains through collaboration with Israeli scholars. And enjoy my frank conversation with Jonah Platt, best known for playing Fiyero in Broadway's Wicked, who now hosts his own hit podcast, Being Jewish with Jonah Platt. Hard to believe all of this and more has unfolded in 2025 alone. May 2026 be peaceful and prosperous for us all. Thank you for listening. This episode is brought to you by AJC. Our producer is Atara Lakritz. Our sound engineer is TK Broderick. You can subscribe to People of the Pod on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts, or learn more at ajc.org/peopleofthepod. The views and opinions of our guests don't necessarily reflect the positions of AJC. We'd love to hear your views and opinions or your questions. You can reach us at peopleofthepod@ajc.org. If you've enjoyed this episode, please be sure to tell your friends, tag us on social media with #PeopleOfThePod, And hop on to Apple Podcasts to rate us and write a review to help more listeners find us. Tune in next week for another episode of People of the Pod.